Immediately fighting for central squares, this pawn opens diagonals for both queen and bishop, dictating early development. Challenging white's central dominion, this Sicilian gambit immediately injects dynamic, asymmetrical play into the game. Developing knights early, like here, often aims to control central squares and prepare for rapid kingside castling. Developing a knight to its natural outpost on c6 contests the center and prepares for queenside expansion, offering a dynamic game. Instantly creating pressure on black's queenside, this maneuver targets the nc6 and sets up potential pins, forcing black to react and consider their pawn structure. Opening the kingside pawn for development, e6 gracefully concedes queenside space to prepare for future pawn pushes and piece activity. Trading the bishop for the knight here strategically weakens black's pawn structure on the queenside, creating a lasting positional imbalance. Doubling pawns disrupts black's pawn structure, potentially opening files for white's rooks later. Opening up lines for your bishop while solidifying central control creates interesting attacking possibilities down the open c-file. Developing this knight opens lines for the queen and bishop, but weakens the king's pawn shield. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside, white immediately injects aggression, aiming to exploit the doubled pawn's weakness and potentially crack open lines towards black's monarch. This aggressive pawn push demands black's careful consideration, neglecting it could lead to a swift collapse of their defenses. A courageous attempt to solidify the kingside pawn structure, though it does create a potential weakness on g6. Aimed at securing the king and preparing queenside development, this queen repositioning is a touch passive, allowing black's king pawn to potentially advance and seize central space. Solidifying the pawn structure, d6 aims to establish a firm central presence and prepare for potential kingside expansion, though it does concede some vertical control of the d-file. Suddenly, the kingside pawn wall is shattered, opening crucial diagonals for your queen and bishop, a bold gambit that promises rapid development and potential attack at the cost of a slightly exposed king. Opening the d-file offers immediate counterplay, challenging white's central pawn thrust and creating a potential outpost for the knight. Unleashing a pawn storm initiative, white boldly contests the center and opens lines, forcing black to confront the growing spatial pressure before it becomes overwhelming. Black boldly advances the knight to f5, a seemingly aggressive outpost, but it creates immediate pressure on white's central pawn structure and opens up potential lines of attack toward the kingside, while also eyeing the light squares, potentially challenging the pawn on d3 and creating a complex tactical battleground. Developing the knight here aims to challenge the knight on f5 and potentially open the c-file for pressure later, but it also neglects the pawn on e5, which has become a juicy target if black can organize a counterattack. Be mindful of how this seemingly simple piece placement might invite complications or subtle positional concessions down the line. Developing the bishop to a passive square, b7, allows white's pawn advance to gain more central influence and restricts black's pieces, potentially leading to an enduring spatial disadvantage that will need careful management to avoid suffocation. Unleashing a pin along the f6 knight, this maneuver immediately puts pressure on black's kingside development and seeks to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses. Unleashing a pawn thrust to challenge the center's equilibrium, black opts to break the rigid pawn chain and open avenues, yet this aggressive pawn push might be sacrificing valuable defensive integrity around the king, creating potential weaknesses for future exploitation. Opening the bishop's diagonal to influence the central pawn structure, white aims to exploit black's compromised kingside pawn formation, potentially preparing for a future pawn thrust on the kingside or a central breakthrough. A wise decision to secure the monarch, tucking it away from the immediate storm brewing on the kingside, where white's early pawn thrusts and piece development seem to be creating significant attacking potential. This castling action not only enhances defensive solidity, but also prepares for a potential counterplay by rerouting the rook to a more active square, perhaps the central c-file, once the pawn storm subsides or shifts. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, white boldly decides to mirror black's defensive pawn structure on the queenside with a king's file onslaught, immediately initiating a dynamic and potentially risky race towards opposite-side castling. The knight's bold thrust to d4 immediately seeks to disrupt white's central control and exploit the awkward placement of black's doubled c-pawns by potentially forcing exchanges that could open lines. This aggressive maneuver is an attempt to seize the initiative, aiming to provoke a reaction and potentially dismantle white's pawn structure or create tactical opportunities by forcing white's pieces into less harmonious positions. It's a gambit of sorts, sacrificing immediate pawn structure integrity for dynamic counterplay and a shot at disrupting white's harmonious setup. Shifting the queen to d2 aims to consolidate the center and prepare for a potential pawn push on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the diagonal towards black's castled position. Initiating queenside expansion with a pawn storm, black aims to disrupt white's kingside castle and open lines for their pieces. Navigating the queenside with newfound fluidity, white's knight sidesteps the central skirmish, aiming to establish a commanding presence on a less contested frontier. The rook scurries to safety, repositioning to potentially support a queenside pawn push or perhaps even shift to the central files later, acknowledging the precariousness of the kingside after white's aggressive pawn advances and the rook's prior inactivity on the 7th rank. Unleashing a pawn storm, white injects immediate dynamism, challenging the central pawn chain and potentially opening lines towards black's uncastled king. This aggressive pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt black's solid setup, creating tactical opportunities and forcing black to react defensively, potentially ceding control of crucial squares. The capture on f6 not only clears the e-file but also allows white's pieces to infiltrate, creating uncomfortable pressure. Opening up the g-file creates a dangerous, yet potentially double-edged, path towards white's castled king, a gamble that demands precise follow-up. Unleashing the bishop to target black's castled king creates immediate attacking potential along the open diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the monarch. Seeking to activate that marooned knight and potentially exploit the open f-file, black endeavors to bring its forces into the fray after an extended period of passive observation. Securing the king with a prophylactic maneuver, white tucks their monarch away, anticipating potential attacks down the central files and reinforcing the queenside's integrity against black's growing influence. Unleashing the c-pawn creates immediate counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and activate black's dormant pieces, particularly the rook on a7, which can now eye the open c-file. Challenging black's centralized knight becomes paramount, aiming to disrupt its excellent central placement and potentially expose the king's defenses. Embracing the open file, black boldly seizes the central pawn, aiming to disrupt white's imposing pawn structure and create counterplay along the now accessible c-file. This tactical gamble sacrifices a pawn for dynamic potential, potentially opening lines towards white's king or creating weaknesses in white's queenside pawn formation if white cannot adequately consolidate. It's a decisive shift, turning the game into a sharp, unbalanced affair where black hopes to leverage initiative for positional advantages or even tactical shots, accepting the immediate material deficit for future compensation. A daring raid on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines against the king. Unleashing the pawn, this move injects a dynamic tension into the center, challenging the knight's secure outpost and creating immediate complications for white's interconnected pawns. Striking at black's advanced knight is a tactical necessity, freeing up the d-file for potential infiltration while simultaneously forcing a strategic decision from the opponent regarding their doubled pawns. Reclaiming the central pawn structure after a tactical skirmish, this recapture strategically reestablishes a more cohesive pawn chain for black and removes white's advanced knight from its promising square, opening avenues for counterplay and potentially freeing up pieces previously tied down by defensive duties. The knight's repositioning to the queenside, aiming for a more active diagonal, overlooks the immediate threat to the d4 pawn, a concession that grants black a dangerous central outpost. Suddenly, the queens become an active element, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside pawns and open lines towards the white king. Swapping queens here unravels the complex middle game tension, steering the game toward a more open, potentially sharp endgame where black's doubled pawns on the c-file become a persistent vulnerability, even as white surrenders the initiative for a cleaner position, forcing black to actively navigate the now exposed queenside, where white's minor pieces might find fertile hunting grounds. The exchange of queens dramatically reshapes the battlefield, handing black a significant strategic concession by solidifying white's central pawn majority and creating a potential majority on the kingside for white's remaining pieces. Initiating a subtle exchange here carves open the d-file, immediately presenting a new battlefield for maneuvering and potentially creating pressure against black's central pawn structure. Re-establishing a strong central presence with the bishop, this maneuver aims to pressure white's pawn chain and potentially disrupt their pawn structure, hinting at a subtle shift towards a more active midfield engagement. Shifting the king to a more secure square on the edge of the board frees up the rook to potentially become active along the long diagonal or through the c-file, while simultaneously preventing any sneaky backrank threats. Unleashing the rook to the open file, black aims to disrupt white's currently passive position, seeking active counterplay by creating threats on the 7th rank and potentially supporting a pawn push or piece maneuver on the queen side. Reclaiming central influence becomes paramount as the knight pivots back to a more active square, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure and contest the open files, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or supporting a future kingside initiative. Exploiting the open c-file, the rook infiltrates black's territory, creating immediate pressure and disrupting white's coordination. Seizing the initiative with this knight capture unravels black's defensive setup, opening up fresh attacking avenues while simultaneously addressing the immediate threat of the advanced rook. Suddenly, the knight on d5 is under immense pressure, and the bishop's repositioning aims to disrupt white's queenside potential and prepare for a tactical counterpunch. The bishop pair's dominance is about to be tested as the rook ventures deep into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Initiating a dangerous pawn storm with that pawn thrust, hoping to create immediate complications and perhaps open a path towards the white king, though it also risks weakening black's own central structure if white can adequately defend. Seeking to dislodge that pesky bishop from its influential post, white opts for a subtle repositioning, a temporary retreat designed to regroup and reevaluate the complex interplay of forces, particularly aiming to challenge black's central pawn majority, which, while currently imposing, may yet prove a target if black overextends or miscalculates the defensive requirements. This piece repositions its diagonal threat, aiming to bolster the center's defensive structure and potentially prepare for future advances, all while keeping an eye on the open files that are starting to emerge. Reinforcing the knight's position offers a vital defensive bulwark against black's encroaching pieces, simultaneously preparing to contest central control and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. Targeting the poorly defended king requires a proactive approach, and repositioning the bishop to b4 aims to disrupt white's defensive setup and exploit the open c-file. Sacrificing the rook on c2 completely surrenders the c-file and c3 square, a crucial hub of activity for white. This radical concession is likely an attempt to generate counterplay or simplify into an endgame where white hopes their material advantage will be decisive. But it feels like a desperate gamble, giving black undisputed dominance over the open file and an immediate positional edge that could prove insurmountable. Black's pawn bravely advances, grabbing the undefended knight and challenging white's central pawn structure. This audacious pawn push ignites a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially open lines for counterplay. Consider the ripple effect of this advance. It forces immediate calculation and repositions pieces dynamically. The rook now anchors itself on the open file, aiming to reclaim the space black surrendered and challenge the b4 bishop's influence. Releasing the pinned piece grants the opponent a tempo to regroup and potentially establish a more robust pawn structure, though it surrenders the initiative and simplifies the position, leaning towards a material advantage for black. Simplifying the position with this pawn push might seem harmless, but it abandons the initiative and unnecessarily weakens the pawn structure on the queen side, potentially creating targets for black's bishops. Finally, black's bishop finds its optimal square, unleashing its influence across the board and creating a powerful battery with the rook aimed at white's beleaguered king, while simultaneously tying down white's knight to defensive duties. The bishop trades itself for the rook, simplifying the position dramatically. This maneuver aims to neutralize black's aggressively placed rook and remove a key defender of the d-pawn. White now faces a simplified endgame where the extra pawn on d3 will be a significant factor. However, the doubled pawns on the c-file might become a long-term weakness if black can coordinate their remaining pieces effectively. The king's safety on the queen side is no longer a primary concern for white, but vigilance is still required to convert the material advantage. The exchange of rooks here drastically alters the endgame's complexion, opening a clear path for your remaining rook to infiltrate and destabilize white's now exposed king. Introducing pawn advances on the queen side aims to disturb black's newly solidified pawn structure and potentially open lines for the rooks, a bold attempt to gain counterplay after the recent exchanges. Snatching the pawn, this move dramatically alters the material balance, but more importantly, it opens a long diagonal for the opposing bishop and creates a potential outpost for black's rook on the now unprotected b4 square. You've accepted the challenge, transforming the position from a tense strategic battle into a more concrete fight for initiative, where precise calculation and exploitation of weaknesses will be paramount. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain, this capture propels the white rook to a vital open file, creating immediate pressure and potential threats against black's remaining pawn weaknesses. The knight's retreat to d4 is a curious tactical sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Black gambles that the pawn majority on the queen side, bolstered by the isolated d-pawn, will prove more potent than white's immediate material advantage. It's a bold decision, banking on the creation of active piece play to compensate for the missing pawn. Reasserting control over the central files becomes paramount as white's knight heads for more active squares, aiming to disrupt black's established pawn chains and possibly exploit weaknesses around the king. Retrieving the pawn allows for a more active rook presence on the open file, potentially creating counterplay against white's advanced pawns and seeking to disrupt the otherwise solid defensive structure. Reactivating the knight to c3 aims to regain lost central influence and potentially reinforce the queen side while scouting for tactical opportunities, hinting at a desire to simplify into a more manageable endgame given the scattered pawn structure. Suddenly, the rook, having completed its circuitous journey across the board, presents a direct ultimatum to the white king.